The wagon creaked its way up the mountain road, each turn of the wheels carrying Victoria closer to the castle that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. Through the gaps in the canvas covering, she could see Valdrin Keep growing larger against the gray autumn sky, its black stone towers rising from the mountain like teeth waiting to devour her. The smell of pine resin mixed with the threat of coming rain, and somewhere far below, a river roared through a gorge she could not see. Victoria kept one hand pressed against her belly, where her child grew beneath the worn fabric of her traveling dress, and the other clasped tight around Elena's trembling fingers. They had been so careful. 2 years of hiding in border villages, using false names, never staying longer than a season. Victoria had learned to bake bread, to mend clothes, to become invisible in the way that servants were invisible to the noble houses who had once bowed to her family. She had allowed herself to believe they might actually survive, that Marcus's child might grow up free of the shadows that consumed its parents. But someone had recognized her face from an old portrait that still circulated on reward posters, and the king's guards had come before dawn, their torches painting orange light across the walls of the tiny cottage where she had dared to feel safe. She had considered fighting. The knife Marcus had given her was still strapped to her thigh beneath her skirts, and she knew how to use it. She had considered dying rather than returning to this place of horrors, joining Marcus in whatever peace waited beyond this life. But one look at Elena's terrified face and the swell of her own belly had stayed her hand. She would survive. For them, she would survive. She would find a way to protect this child, even if it meant walking into the wolf's den with her head held high. The smell of pine and approaching rain filled the wagon as they climbed higher, the temperature dropping with each turn of the road. Somewhere in the distant mountains, wolves howled, their voices echoing off the stone peaks in a chorus that raised the hair on Victoria's arms. She could no longer tell if they were true wolves or the werewolves that roamed these lands, the shifters who had once been her kingdom's allies before the war. The sound carried memory with it. Nights spent listening to similar howls from her bedroom window in the Ashford castle that no longer existed, before she had learned to fear the creatures that made such sounds. The wagon lurched to a stop, and rough hands pulled back the canvas. Guards in black armor with the Valdrin wolf emblazoned on their chests dragged Victoria into the fading daylight of the outer courtyard. Her feet found uneven cobblestones slick with recent rain, and she forced herself to stand straight despite the ache in her lower back, despite the exhaustion of 3 days in the wagon, despite the terror that threatened to buckle her knees. The cold bit through her thin cloak, but she kept her face composed in the rigid mask of royal training that her mother had drilled into her from childhood. They would not see her fear. Whatever came next, they would not have the satisfaction of watching the last Ashford princess break. Servants stopped to stare as she was marched through the gates and into the inner courtyard. Their whispers followed her like a cold wind, scraps of conversation she could not quite catch, but whose tone she understood perfectly. She caught fragments of their words as she passed. Ashford princess, with child, the prophecy. The word prophecy sent ice through her veins, though she did not know why. Her mother had spoken of prophecies in the old days, the cryptic pronouncements of seers who could glimpse the threads of fate, but Victoria had never paid much attention. Prophecies were for scholars and mystics, not for princesses learning statecraft and healing arts. The corridors of Valdrin Keep seemed endless, deliberately designed to disorient. Torches flickered in iron brackets set into walls of black stone, casting shadows that danced like demons on every surface. The air smelled of smoke and old stone and something else, something animal, that reminded Victoria with every breath that this was a castle of werewolves. She memorized what she could, counting turns, noting guard positions, seeking any advantage that might serve her later. 23 steps from the outer door to the first staircase, 14 steps up, then a turn to the right. Another corridor, longer this time, the torches spaced further apart. When they tried to separate Elena from her, Victoria finally spoke, her voice carrying the command of generations of royalty. The guards hesitated, exchanged glances, but ultimately ignored her. They pulled her handmaiden away despite Victoria's protests, Elena's fingers slipping from hers as two guards dragged the smaller woman down a side corridor. Elena's frightened eyes met hers one last time before she disappeared around a corner, and Victoria felt another piece of her heart crack. She would find Elena. She would protect her. But first, she had to survive whatever waited at the end of this endless march through enemy territory. The great hall opened before her like the maw of some ancient beast. Vaulted ceilings rose so high they disappeared into shadow, stone ribs arching overhead like the skeleton of some enormous creature. 100 candles burned in iron chandeliers, but their light could not fully illuminate the vast space, leaving pools of darkness in every corner. Tapestries hung on the walls, depicting scenes of war and conquest that Victoria recognized with a sick lurch of her stomach. The fall of the Eastern Alliance, the burning of the Ashford lands, the triumph of the Valdrin Wolf over all who had opposed it. At the far end, on a raised dais of black stone, sat the wolf throne. The throne had been carved from a single block of obsidian, shaped by ancient craftsmen into the form of a snarling wolf. Its eyes were set with rubies that caught the candlelight like drops of blood, and its stone fangs curved around whoever sat upon it as if preparing to devour them. It was a throne designed to intimidate, to remind all who approached that they stood before the power of the pack, the alpha of all alphas, and upon it sat the Alpha King himself. Victor Valdrin was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 at most, with black hair cut shorter than court fashion dictated. His face was all hard angles, a warrior's face, with a scar crossing his left eyebrow that spoke of battles survived. But it was his eyes that caught Victoria and would not let her go. They were pale gray, almost silver in the candlelight, with a quality that seemed to see through flesh to the secrets beneath. A werewolf's eyes, she realized, though he wore his human form. His warrior's build seemed wrong for a throne room, too large, too contained, like a blade kept too long in its sheath and hungry to be drawn. He watched her approach without expression, and Victoria straightened her spine, meeting his gaze with all the defiance she could muster. She was the last of the Ashfords, daughter of a king, sister of princes, raised to rule a kingdom that no longer existed. She would not bow, she would not beg. If he meant to kill her, he would have to do it while she stood on her own 2 feet, looking him in the eye. She expected him to gloat. She expected pronouncements of execution, threats of torture. Perhaps a public display meant to demonstrate his power over the last remnant of a conquered enemy. She expected the monster, who had destroyed everything she loved, to wear his cruelty openly, to revel in her helplessness. Instead, the Alpha King dismissed his guards with a wave of his hand. The great doors closed behind them with a boom that echoed through the empty hall, and Victoria stood alone before the wolf throne in the flickering candlelight. When he spoke, his voice was lower than she had imagined, rougher, as if he rarely used it for anything but commands. He knew about her pregnancy, he said. He knew Marcus had been the father, the last general of the Ashford armies, who had died 2 months past protecting her from mercenaries hunting for the reward on her head. He knew the child she carried was the last heir to the Ashford bloodline, the only remaining descendant of a royal house that stretched back 1,000 years. Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture she could not suppress. She felt the child move beneath her palm, a flutter like butterfly wings, as if it sensed the danger. She waited for the killing blow, for the order that would end the last trace of her kingdom forever. Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if he could hear it with his wolf's senses, wondered if he could smell her fear despite her attempts to hide it. The killing blow did not come. Victor offered protection instead. Safety. A place in his household where she could carry her child to term, where the heir to Ashford could grow up under his guardianship. He spoke of rooms prepared, of healers standing ready, of everything she might need for a comfortable confinement. Victoria stared at him, searching for the trap, the deception, the cruelty behind the offer. She had spent 3 years imagining what this man would do to her if he caught her. 3 years of nightmares filled with fire and blood and the screams of the dying. She had never imagined kindness. She found only something she could not name in those silver eyes, something that looked almost like pain, like guilt, like the weight of sins he could not put down. It made no sense. He was the conqueror, the destroyer, the man whose banner had flown over her burning city. He should be triumphant, not haunted. She refused to believe him. The words poured out of her, accusations she had carried for 3 years like stones in her chest. She recited the names of dead nobles, their faces clear in her memory, their deaths on his hands. Lord Ashford, her father, cut down defending the throne room. Lady Ashford, her mother, burned with the castle when she refused to surrender. Her brothers, all 4 of them, executed in the courtyard, while the conquering army cheered. Cousins, aunts, uncles, an entire family tree reduced to ash and memory, and one pregnant woman standing alone before their murderer. Victor did not defend himself. He did not explain or justify or argue. He simply listened, his silver eyes never leaving her face, his expression unchanging except for a muscle that twitched in his jaw with each name she spoke. When she had exhausted her fury, when her voice cracked and her body trembled with the effort of not weeping, he spoke 4 words that cut through everything she thought she knew. He had killed his father. Victoria saw it then, looking at him with new eyes. The defensive scars on his hands, visible as he gripped the arms of the throne, the kind of scars a man earned when blocking a blade aimed at his throat. The weight behind his eyes, the exhaustion that went deeper than sleepless nights. The guilt that bent his shoulders even as he sat upon his throne, as if the crown itself was a burden he had not asked to bear. He had been at the northern border when the order came, he said, his voice flat and empty. Defending against an incursion that had never materialized, a convenient distraction arranged by advisors who knew he would have stopped them. He had returned to find smoke rising from the Ashford lands, his father's madness finally unleashed, atrocities committed in his name that he could never undo. He had confronted his father in this very hall, demanded answers that came only in ravings about prophecies and bloodlines and the necessity of eliminating threats. And when his father had drawn a blade and come at him with murder in his eyes, Victor had done what he had to do. Victoria did not believe him. She could not allow herself to believe him, because if she did, everything she had built her survival upon would crumble. She needed to hate him. She needed the clarity of her rage to sustain her. But something cracked in the wall of her hatred nonetheless, letting in a sliver of doubt she could not quite ignore. They took her to chambers, not dungeons. A luxurious room in the East Tower with a window overlooking a sheer drop to the rocks below. Comfortable furniture that must have cost more than a village earned in a year, and a fire already burning in a hearth large enough to stand in. Tapestries covered the cold stone walls, and thick carpets softened the floor beneath her aching feet. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. The door locked behind her, and Victoria finally allowed herself to collapse into a velvet chair, her hands shaking, her mind reeling with questions she could not answer. 3 days passed in that tower room, each one longer than the last. Victoria paced the chamber until she had memorized every stone in the walls, every thread in the tapestries, every way the light changed as the sun moved across the sky outside her window. She planned escape routes that were impossible and rescue scenarios that would never come. She watched the guards change shifts below her window, timing their rotations, noting which ones seemed alert and which ones dozed at their posts. She catalogued every scrap of information that might prove useful, though she could not imagine how she would ever use it. When Elena was finally brought to her on the fourth day, shaken but unharmed, Victoria felt the first real relief since their capture. They clung to each other in the firelight, speaking in whispers about what they had learned, what they feared, what they hoped despite everything. Elena had been put to work in the kitchens, invisible among the other servants, and she had listened as servants always listened, catching whispers that nobles thought were private. The servants talked, Elena reported. They said Victor was different from his father, that he had ended the old king's reign of madness with his own hands. They said he had tried to stop the slaughter of the Ashfords, had arrived too late, had spent years trying to undo the damage of the war. They spoke of him with something that sounded almost like respect, almost like affection, as if he were a king who earned loyalty rather than demanding it. Victoria dismissed it as propaganda, the convenient stories conquerors told to make themselves heroes. She had heard such tales before, knew how history could be rewritten to serve the victors. But that night, as she lay sleepless in the too-soft bed, she found a book among the volumes in her chamber that made her doubt everything she thought she knew. It was an Ashford history, a chronicle of her kingdom written by the royal historian 300 years ago, a book she had believed lost in the burning of the great library. The pages were yellowed but intact, the binding cracked but whole, the words of her ancestors preserved against all odds. Inside the front cover, in careful handwriting she did not recognize, someone had left a note. "I saved what I could." There was no signature, but the implication was clear. Victoria held the book to her chest and wept, great silent sobs that shook her whole body. She wept for her family, for her kingdom, for everything that was lost. But woven through her grief was something else, something that felt like confusion, like the foundations of her certainty shifting beneath her feet. The monster who had destroyed her world had also saved this piece of it. The contradiction would not resolve, no matter how she turned it in her mind. Victor sought her out in the castle's inner garden a week after her arrival, a courtyard of hardy plants surrounding a frozen fountain that would not flow again until spring. The gray sky threatened snow that had not yet fallen, and Victoria's breath misted in the cold as she paced the gravel paths, her guards keeping a respectful distance. She had been allowed outside for the first time, a privilege that felt more like strategy than kindness, and she had not yet decided what to make of it. He approached without his guards, hands empty, wearing no visible weapon. The simple gray wool of his clothing was barely more formal than a servant's, nothing like the ceremonial armor of their first meeting, and Victoria found herself unsettled by the difference. This was not the Alpha King coming to intimidate a prisoner. This was something else, something she did not have a name for. She responded to his attempt at conversation with the cold fury of 3 years of loss. She recited the names of dead Ashford nobles like a litany of prayer, watching his face for any sign of satisfaction, any hint of the cruelty she knew must be hiding beneath his composed exterior. She wanted to see the monster. She needed him to be the monster. But his expression showed only something that looked terribly like grief. He did not defend himself against her accusations. He accepted her hatred as his due, standing silent in the frozen garden while she hurled words at him like weapons. And then, when she had exhausted herself, when she stood trembling with cold and rage and something that felt dangerously like tears, he told her the truth of that night. He had been at the northern border when his father gave the order to attack. He said again, his voice rough with something she could not identify. 300 miles away, dealing with a border incursion that he now knew had been arranged by his father's advisors to keep him away. He had ridden back the moment word reached him, pushed his horse to exhaustion, and then run the final miles in his wolf form, But he had arrived too late. The Ashford castle was already ash, the royal family was already dead, and his father was already mad beyond all reason, raving about prophecies and destiny and the necessity of eliminating the Ashford line. Victor had confronted him in the throne room, he continued, his silver eyes fixed on the frozen fountain as if he could not bear to look at her while he spoke. He had demanded answers, demanded that his father see reason, demanded that the madness end. His father had responded with a blade and the declaration that Victor was weak, unworthy, contaminated by his mother's bloodline, and thus a threat to be eliminated along with all the others. The fight had lasted only minutes, he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. His father had been a great warrior in his youth, but madness had made him careless. Victor had the scars to prove how close it had been, how narrowly he had survived, how many times his father's blade had found flesh before Victor's had found his father's heart. He did not regret what he had done. He could not afford to regret it. But he had not slept through a full night since, and he doubted he ever would again. Victoria looked at the scars on his hands, clearly visible in the gray winter light, and understood now what they meant. She saw the way he held himself, the careful control that masked something she finally recognized as exhaustion, as grief, as guilt that had eaten at him for 3 years, just as her hatred had eaten at her. He was not the monster she had imagined. He was something far more complicated, far more human, and far more dangerous to the walls she had built around her heart. She asked him why. Why protect her child? Why save her people's books? Why offer safety to the last survivor of a kingdom his family had destroyed? And for the first time, Victor Valdrin had no answer. He simply stood there in the frozen garden, breath misting in the cold, unable to put into words the weight of what he carried. The days turned to weeks, and Victoria found herself pulled into an unexpected rhythm that she could not quite resist. Victor came to her chambers in the evenings, bringing questions about Ashford history that revealed a genuine desire to understand what had been lost. He wanted to know about the old treaties, the alliances that had held for centuries before his father's madness had shattered them. He wanted to understand the political structures, the cultural traditions, the healing arts that Ashford women had passed down for generations. She realized with growing amazement that he was trying to rebuild, not just the physical structures, though Elena reported that construction had begun in the Ashford lands. He was trying to restore the knowledge, the wisdom, the cultural heritage that had been destroyed along with the people. He wanted her help, because she was the only one who could give it. The only repository of 1,000 years of history that had not been lost to flame. Victoria tested him with deliberate misinformation about a minor treaty, curious whether he would catch the error or accept her words at face value. He caught it within moments, correcting her gently and citing the actual terms from memory. He had studied, she realized. He had spent years reading every surviving document from the Ashford archives, piecing together fragments of a culture he had never been meant to destroy. They argued about history during those evening visits, about interpretations and intentions and the weight of what had been done. Victoria defended her father's decisions with a passion she had not felt since the fall, and Victor challenged her assumptions with a scholar's precision that surprised her. They debated what the future might hold, whether the old alliances could ever be restored, whether the werewolf kingdoms could find a new balance or were doomed to endless cycles of war. For brief moments, Victoria forgot to hate him. They were simply two people talking, two minds matched in intelligence and passion, finding unexpected common ground in their shared obsession with the past. She caught herself looking forward to his visits, listening for his footsteps in the corridor, feeling her heart lift when the door opened and he appeared with another stack of documents and another dozen questions. The realization terrified her. She retreated behind her walls, reminded herself of the names she had recited, reminded herself that whatever Victor had or had not done, his family had destroyed hers. But the walls were growing thin, worn away by every conversation, every moment of unexpected understanding. Every time his silver eyes met hers and she saw something that looked like hope. The poisoning happened during a council meeting 3 weeks after Victoria's arrival. She was present at Victor's insistence, seated in a chair beside the throne in a statement to the court that she had not asked for but could not refuse. The nobles watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed hatred, and Victoria kept her face composed and her hands folded over her belly, revealing nothing. She watched the faces around the table, reading them for threat or opportunity as her mother had taught her. Lord Thorne, the master of coin, observed from a shadowed corner with an expression of scholarly disapproval that made her skin crawl. There was something wrong about him, something that did not match the mild appearance he cultivated, though she could not have said what it was. His dark eyes followed her every movement, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty hall. Lord Aldrich, Victor's younger brother, lifted his goblet to drink, and moments later, he collapsed. Chaos erupted in the great hall. Guards shouted orders that contradicted each other, servants screamed and fled, nobles rose from their seats in confusion and alarm. The court physician came running with his bag of remedies, his face pale with terror as he knelt beside the convulsing lord. Victoria watched from her chair, frozen by the sudden violence of it, as Aldrich's body arched and twisted on the stone floor. Something stirred in her memory as she watched the symptoms unfold. The sequence was wrong for common poisons, too specific, too controlled. The way his muscles contracted, the foam at his lips, the particular blue tinge of his fingernails. She knew this poison. She had learned its characteristics at her mother's knee, part of the Ashford healer's training that had been passed down through generations of royal women. Ashford's Bane, they had called it. A poison unique to her homeland, deadly if untreated but curable if you knew the antidote. It had been developed centuries ago as a last defense against invasion, a way to poison wells and food stores if all else failed. The knowledge of both the poison and its cure had been closely guarded, restricted to the royal family and a handful of trusted healers. It should have died with her kingdom. Victoria did not think. She did not weigh consequences or calculate advantage or consider what this action might cost her. She simply moved, rising from her chair and pushing through the crowd of panicking nobles to kneel beside Aldrich's writhing body. She commanded the court physician to step aside in a voice that brooked no argument, the voice of a princess giving orders in her own hall. She turned to the nearest servant and began issuing instructions. She needed meadowsweet, she said, and witch hazel, and honey, and 3 drops of essence of elderflower. She needed vinegar and salt, clean water and clean cloth. She needed a brazier to heat the mixture and a pot to brew it in. The servants scattered to obey, responding to her authority without question, and Victoria set to work. She worked through the night, her back aching from kneeling on the stone floor, her hands moving with the precision of training that she had not used since the fall of her kingdom. The child within her was restless, kicking and turning as if disturbed by her tension, and she murmured soothing words between instructions. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Aldrich's breathing had steadied, his color had returned, and the poison's grip had released its hold. He would live. Victor found her there as the first gray light crept through the windows. Exhausted in a chair beside his brother's bed, where servants had finally convinced her to sit. His gratitude was raw and unguarded, stripped of the kingly composure he wore like armor. Aldrich was all the family he had left, he told her, his voice rough with emotion he did not try to hide. The only person in the world who knew him as something other than a king. The only link to the childhood they had shared before crowns and wars and the weight of impossible choices. Victoria accepted his thanks with a dignity she did not entirely feel. Then she told him what she had realized during the long night of working to save his brother's life. The poison had been meant for Victor. Aldrich had simply drunk from the wrong cup, perhaps reaching for his brother's goblet when his own was empty. Someone in this castle had access to Ashford's secrets that should have died with her kingdom. Someone had the knowledge and the will to use them against the king. Victor's expression hardened as he absorbed her words, the softness of his gratitude replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. He promised to find the traitor, to tear apart his own court if necessary to discover who had done this thing. Victoria insisted on helping. She was the only one who truly understood Ashford's secrets, the only one who might be able to trace how those secrets had been stolen and by whom. It was the first moment of true partnership between them, enemies working together toward a common goal. The alliance changed everything. They spent hours in Victor's private study, poring over maps and documents, tracing the connections that might lead to the traitor. Victoria studied lists of everyone who had access to the Ashford archives before the fall, cross-referencing with current members of the Valdrin court. She analyzed the specific formulation of the poison, noting variations that might indicate who had taught the poisoner. She used her understanding of her own kingdom's secrets to identify the narrow circle of people who could have possessed this knowledge. Lord Thorne's name kept appearing in her investigations. He had been an advisor to Victor's father, she learned, present at the planning of the campaign against the Ashfords. He had argued for the complete destruction of the kingdom, the elimination of every possible survivor, the burning of libraries and archives to ensure no one could ever piece together what had been lost. And he had watched Victoria with barely concealed hatred since the moment of her arrival, tracking her movements with the focused attention of a predator. She caught Victor looking at her differently as they worked side by side, his silver eyes following her movements, lingering on her face when he thought she would not notice. She found herself returning his gaze, studying the way the candlelight softened his harsh features, the way his fingers moved across maps with a scholar's precision that belied his warrior's build. The attraction had crept up on her, growing in the spaces between arguments, taking root in moments of shared understanding. She pushed it away, but it would not stay buried. The discovery came at midnight, when Victoria could not sleep and walked the castle corridors to ease her restless mind. The child had been active all day, pressing against her bladder, making rest impossible. She padded through the darkened halls in her nightgown and a borrowed robe, following paths she had memorized during her captivity. She heard voices around a corner, hushed and urgent, and pressed herself into an alcove to listen. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared they would hear it, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to become invisible the way Elena had taught her. Lord Thorne stood with a hooded figure in the shadows, speaking of prophecies and bloodlines. "The Ashford heir must never be born," he said in that soft, scholarly voice that had always made her skin crawl. The prophecy must not be fulfilled. They had come too close to failing, relying on poison when more direct methods might be needed. The pregnancy must end, and the Ashford line must die. Victoria pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp, her other arm curling protectively around her belly. She heard the ancient words repeated, "When Ashford blood quickens in shadow, the usurper's throne shall crumble." She understood now why Thorne watched her with such hatred, why he had argued for the complete destruction of her kingdom. He believed the prophecy. He feared what her child might become. She learned more as she listened, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Thorne had orchestrated the original massacre, had been the one to convince Victor's father that the Ashfords posed an existential threat. He had arranged for Victor to be sent to the northern border, had ensured the king's madness would have free reign. Everything that had happened, all the death and destruction that had shaped her life for the past 3 years, had been Thorne's design. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot, and Thorne turned. Victoria ran. Her bare feet slapped against cold stone, her arms curled protectively around her belly, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she navigated the maze of corridors. She heard pursuit behind her, boots and shouts and the clatter of weapons being drawn. The East Tower stairwell rose before her, and she climbed, seeking her chambers, seeking Elena, seeking any kind of safety. The child moved within her, responding to her terror, and she whispered promises she might not be able to keep. They cornered her on the stairs, guards above and below, Thorn's soft voice floating up from the shadows. He climbed toward her with the unhurried pace of a man who had already won, explaining his plan with scholarly precision as if lecturing a student. She would die here, her death blamed on Ashford loyalists who had infiltrated the castle. Victor would never know the truth. He would mourn her, perhaps, if he had truly begun to care, but he would accept the official story because he would have no reason to doubt it. The prophecy would remain unfulfilled, Thorn continued. The bloodline would end. The work he had devoted his life to would finally be complete. It was nothing personal, he assured her. She seemed like an intelligent woman, under different circumstances someone he might have respected. But the safety of the kingdom required her death, and he had learned long ago to do what was necessary. Victoria grabbed a torch from its bracket and swung. The first guard went down screaming, his face burned, his hands clawing at his eyes. Victoria kicked at the second, her foot connecting with his knee, bought herself precious seconds as he stumbled back. She screamed for help with everything she had, the sound echoing through the stone stairwell, and prayed that someone would hear. Thorn's remaining men regrouped, closing in, and she backed up the stairs with the torch held before her like a sword. The heat seared her fingers, the flames too close to her face, but she did not let go. She would not die here. She would not let them take her child. If this was her end, she would face it fighting, face it standing, face it with the pride of 1,000 years of Ashford royalty burning as bright as the fire in her hands. Victor appeared at the top of the stairs like vengeance given form. His eyes had shifted to wolf gold, his teeth bared in a snarl that was not entirely human, and for the first time Victoria saw the predator that lived beneath his skin. He launched himself down the stairs with a speed that should not have been possible, Declan a heartbeat behind him, and the narrow stairwell became a battlefield. The fight was brutal and brief, steel ringing against stone, blood spraying on the walls, screams cut short by killing blows. A guard's blade came too close to Victoria, and Victor roared, throwing himself between her and the weapon. The blade caught his arm instead, opening a gash that sprayed crimson across the gray stone. He barely seemed to notice, cutting down the guard in the same motion, positioning himself between Victoria and every threat. Thorn tried to flee. Declan caught him, slamming the older man against the wall with force that cracked stone, and Thorn's spectacles shattered on the stairs. For the first time, Victoria saw fear in those calculating dark eyes, the terror of a schemer who had finally been caught. When it was over, Victoria knelt beside Victor on the blood-slicked stairs, pressing her hands against his wound, calling for bandages and hot water and all the supplies she would need. Her healer's training took over, pushing aside the terror and the rage. She worked with steady hands even as her heart raced, cleaning and stitching and binding the wound, while Victor watched her face with an expression that stripped away every wall she had built. In his chambers, with the fire burning low and guards posted at every entrance, Victoria finished tending his wounds. The gash on his arm was deep but clean, and her stitches were small and precise, the work of years of training. Her fingers traced the edges of the bandage, checking the tightness, and she felt the heat of his skin beneath her touch. The intimacy of the moment crashed over her, all the barriers gone, all the pretense exhausted. Victor asked her to stay. Not as a prisoner, he said, not as a political asset or a symbol to be paraded before the court, as something else, something he struggled to name, something that had grown between them in stolen moments and shared documents, and the strange alchemy of enemies becoming more than enemies. Victoria met his silver eyes, still touched with gold, and asked if he felt what she felt. His answer came not in words, but in the way his hand rose to cup her cheek, the way he leaned toward her despite the pain of his wound, the way he paused just before their lips met, giving her the choice. Always giving her the choice, even now, even when they both knew what the answer would be. She chose. The kiss was tentative at first, weighted with all the history between them, the blood and the loss and the long road to this moment. Then Victoria's hands found the back of his neck, careful of his injury, and Victor pulled her closer with his good arm, and the kiss became something else entirely. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, Victoria knew there was no going back. The woman who had hated him was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that love could grow in the strangest soil. The trial of Lord Thorn drew the entire court to the great hall. Victoria stood beside Victor on the dais, no longer a prisoner but a partner, and presented the evidence she had gathered. Her voice did not waver as she detailed Thorn's crimes, his manipulation of Victor's father, his orchestration of the massacre, his attempts to complete the destruction he had begun 3 years ago. She spoke not as a victim pleading for justice, but as an expert commanding attention, and she watched the faces of nobles who had dismissed her transform into expressions of respect and fear. Thorn's defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. His co-conspirators turned on him, seeking mercy through cooperation, revealing the full scope of a plot that had shaped the fate of kingdoms. The old prophecy was addressed at last, the words that had haunted Thorn's nightmares read aloud in the great hall. When Ashford blood quickens in shadow, the usurper's throne shall crumble. Victoria spoke to the meaning of those words, the interpretation that Thorn had never considered. The prophecy spoke not of destruction, but of restoration, not of the fall of Valdrin, but of the union of 2 kingdoms into something stronger. Her child was not a threat to Victor's throne, but a bridge, a living connection between 2 peoples who had been at war for generations. The crumbling was not collapse, but transformation, the old order giving way to something new. Victor stood before his people and acknowledged the wrongs done to the Ashford kingdom. He did not excuse or diminish or deflect the responsibility. He took it upon himself, as head of his house, to atone for what his father had done and what he had failed to prevent. He announced his intention to rebuild the Ashford lands, to restore what could be restored, to honor the memory of those who had been lost. And he announced that Victoria would stand beside him as he did it. The ruins of Ashford Keep stood silent under a winter sky, snow dusting the broken walls like a shroud. Victoria walked through the ashes of her childhood home, her feet finding familiar paths beneath the debris, her hand finding Victor's as he walked beside her. The great hall where she had learned to dance was open to the sky. Its roof collapsed, its glory reduced to rubble. The library where she had studied was a blackened shell. Her mother's garden was choked with weeds, the roses dead, the fountain silent. She mourned as she walked, finally allowing herself to grieve fully for everything she had lost. Victor held her as she wept, his arms solid and warm around her, his silence a gift more precious than any words. He did not try to comfort her, did not offer platitudes about healing and time. He simply stood with her in the ruins and let her feel the weight of her loss. He showed her the builders working on the outer walls, architects with plans spread on makeshift tables, foundations being laid for new structures that would honor the old. He had begun this project months ago, she realized, before she had arrived, before he had any reason to hope. He had started trying to make amends before he ever knew if there was anyone left to make amends to. Her child would grow up knowing both heritages, he promised, The heir to Ashford would also be heir to Valdrin, raised to honor both bloodlines, to build bridges instead of walls. The kingdoms would not merge or disappear but stand together, equal and allied, the way they had been before madness and fear had torn them apart. Victoria looked at the man who had been her enemy, who had become her ally, who had somehow become the person she could not imagine living without. She told him she loved him, there among the ruins of everything she had lost, and watched his silver eyes fill with an emotion she had never expected to see. He told her he did not deserve her love, and she told him she did not care what he deserved. She had chosen him. She would keep choosing him every day for as long as she had. The wedding joined more than two people. It joined two kingdoms, two histories, two futures that had seemed destined for blood and ended in something that looked remarkably like hope. The great hall of Valdrin Keep blazed with candles, decorated in both Ashford green and Valdrin black, filled with nobles from both houses who had come to witness the impossible. Victoria wore a gown of Ashford silk, salvaged from the destruction and preserved through years of hiding, the last piece of her old life transformed into the foundation of her new one. Victor wore the crown of his house but carried at his side a blade of Ashford steel, recovered from the ruins and restored to gleaming beauty, a symbol of the union they were forging. They spoke their vows before the assembled court, and the words carried weight beyond mere ceremony. Victoria vowed to build rather than avenge, to honor the dead by nurturing the living, to choose love over hate every day of her life. She vowed to be a partner and a queen, a mother and a healer, to use her knowledge and her strength in service of the peace they had found. Victor vowed to protect and restore, to spend his reign undoing the damage of his father's madness, to be worthy of the forgiveness he had never expected to receive. He vowed to be the king his people deserved, the partner Victoria needed, the father their child would be proud of. Their hands joined over the altar as they shared the ceremonial wine, and in Victoria's belly, the child kicked once, strong and sure, as if in blessing. The court erupted in cheers as Victor kissed his bride. Elena wept with joy beside Commander Declan, who wore an expression of satisfaction that spoke to years of worry finally resolved. Outside the castle walls, the people of both kingdoms celebrated a peace that had been paid for in blood and sealed in love. Victoria looked out at the future from the circle of Victor's arms. She thought of everything they had lost, the roads they had traveled, the enemies they had been. She thought of the child she carried, who would never know the war that had shaped its parents, but would grow up in the peace they had built together. She thought of the kingdoms they would rule side by side, Ashford reborn and Valdrin transformed, united not by conquest, but by choice. Victor's hand found her belly, resting where their heir grew, and Victoria covered his fingers with her own. They had begun as enemies, shaped by war and loss and the weight of crimes committed before they ever met. They had become something far more complicated, far more profound, far more real. In the candlelit great hall of a castle that had once been the seat of her nightmares, Victoria found something she had never expected to find again: home.